Hello, my name is Kevin. I'm the host of this channel, Kevin Wonders, and I wanted to talk about a couple of verses in Ezekiel 28. I thought it was really interesting when I read them because it it sort of um, illuminates this question that I think is sort of an age-old question, where people are wondering, why is it that some people seem to be blessed by God, while others seem to maybe be cursed by God, or seem to, like, essentially, why do some people have an easier time? Why do some people have a harder time? And it's interesting because I think our presumption is, as Christians or as those who are choosing to follow God and live in accordance with His laws, that our lives will be blessed or will be, and I think they are blessed, but I think the maybe the further assumption is that our lives will be easy, and it doesn't seem like that seems to be quite the case. And it almost seems like the opposite tends to happen. I think is in the Psalms, it was somewhere in Psalms or in Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, where it was talking about, like, why do the wicked prosper? Why does it seem like those who act unjustly benefit from their actions? And so it's a question that I think a lot of people have been asking and for a long period of time. And I don't know that there's like really a complete answer for it. I think it's one of those things that there has to be, I think there has to be surrounding God a level of inscrutability, or a level of just God sits, I think, in a position of, in some degree and on some things, sort of a sense of unknowing, or a sense of perhaps too great to comprehend on our part. And so it where was I going with that? It's talking about inscrutability of God. And so I think, like, as God is in some sense inscrutable, I think it points almost to his objective goodness. And I think in our subjective response can be flawed in interpreting God's objective goodness. And what I mean by that is, I think that there are things that, or there's parameters that we might try to judge God's actions that we again would presume that God would adhere to, although it doesn't seem that He does that. It doesn't seem that he adheres to those laws, or adheres to those presumptions that we might expect Him to. Again, the presumption that, like, if I serve God, my life will be easy, and I'll be happy all the time, or I'll be happy most of the time, even. And you would expect then the opposite, right? Those who do not serve God would have a harder time, and their life would not be as easy. But I think in this chapter in Ezekiel 28, in these verses, it seems to almost point at, I don't want to say the opposite, but it points at sort of that quality of God being inscrutable. So I'll read these verses here. It's talking about the king of Tyre and or the nation of Tyre. So he says in verse 12, thus says the Lord God, you had the full measure of perfection and the finishing touch of completeness, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold, the workmanship of your setting in your sockets was in you. They were prepared on the day that you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers and protects. And I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness and evil were found in you. Through the abundance of your commerce, you were internally filled with lawlessness and violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you out as profane and unholy thing from the mountain of God. So it's so strange because in the context of this, the verses before and the verses coming after, I don't see any notion that the nation of Tyre had any propensity to serve God. It seems as though they had completely disregarded God and really had no desire to add him to a part of their life. But it's strange because what you see then is this nation that is not serving God, but is being established by God, right? And so, to me, this points to again, that quality of God that is inscrutable. And I think when we try to measure God's objective goodness, right? If you can allow that God is objectively good, then you have to ask well, why how do these things fit into that nature or that character of God? And so I think what you have to then what the question then is why would God be establishing Tyre in this way? Why does he say this, the phrase you were in Eden, or they were prepared on the day that you were created, right? So there's this sense of foreknowledge on God's part where he's putting them and surrounding them in that in that garden in Eden, right? So that they can flourish, so that they can be productive, and it was as if it was designed for them prior to their inception. So it's how can this nation that is, as far as I can tell, not a godly nation, why are they being blessed by God? Why are they being established by God? And so again, it kind of harkens back to that old question of well, why do the wicked prosper? And why is it not that those who follow God's law and adhere to it are wealthy and have an easy life, and those who are wicked have a hard and demeaning life? Why is that not the case? Because it seems that would be that's almost seems like our expectation of God. But again, I think that if you can allow and if you accept that God is objectively good, right, then it puts us in a different perspective, because you have to then say well, then God in the establishing of Tyre was doing something good for the world, right? Was it because that they were a large trading nation, right? That perhaps they were establishing trade routes, or they were sort of advancing the society of the world, or that they being masters of the sea sort of began began to build ships or began to build boats and figure out how to direct these things, and how to sort of expand our knowledge of the things that we can apprehend. So there, there's got to be there has to be some reason for it. However, however it sits, sort of in opposition to what we would presume God to be, or presume how God should act. And you could almost see the same thing of King Nebuchadnezzar, right, or of Babylon. Throughout Ezekiel, God is using Babylon to judge the nations, essentially. And it's interesting, especially when they're brought on Tyre. They, it seems as if that the storming of Tyre, or the sort of not the crusade, but the battle against Tyre has been an arduous one, and so they have no really real spoil to take from Tyre, the Babylonians, and so God is like, I'm going to give them Egypt essentially, for their spoil because of what they have done, and the diction here is interesting because it's what they have done in Tyre they have done for me, God says, right? And so that it's like, again, extremely strange when you see this like Babylonian Empire that again seems not to serve God at all, or has no really desire to include God in their life or in their cultural life. Is God saying like they're doing this for me, right? And so it's so strange like how God, not strange in a bad way, but it just seems so perplexing like how God chooses to establish like the world religion, or not world religions, but chooses to establish the world empires, right? How he chooses to establish it certain individuals, and I think it kind of goes back to that. Um, Jordan Peterson talks about it in We Who Wrestle with God, about sort of the difference between Cain and Abel. Right, obviously, there's the differences in their sacrifices, but he kind of points at a difference in like, well, if God wanted to bless Abel, and God sort of like preferred Abel, um, or if God, if God wanted to bless Abel, like why could he not do that? Could that, like, is that something that he is unable to do? Right? Could he prefer Abel? So it's interesting. It's interesting of like, we expect God to be like, when I've done all these things for God, that, oh, God like values me, and he like wants to use me. And I think you see that, like, you think of Isaiah, right, where like, the God's calling in, and he's like, who's going to answer? And Isaiah is like, choose me, I'm here. So I think that it's like, all this is not saying that God just like doesn't care about the people who follow him, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that it seems as though like you have the people who are like Isaiah, right? The people who are like Enoch, for instance, the people who are like Abel, right? Who are like devoting their life to serving God, like Abraham, and they're being established. But then you also have sort of the flip side of that. You have Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. You have Tyre, right? Where there's like people who seem to have no indication, right? They seem to have no indication of like incurring God into their life, but yet they're being established. So it's an interesting thing that I often wonder about, and the only real conclusion I can draw from it is that God has to be objectively good, right? And so if you allow that God is omniscient, right, and then he's the Alpha and the Omega, at the beginning, right, at the beginning of time and the end of time, then you can understand then that God, like, from the end of time, can look back and say like, well, in the present moment, like the now, these are the things that have to happen so that the greatest good can occur, or can culminate. And it might seem as though to us these, where we're a little more like one dimensional, if not three dimensional. We're like, well, these are the things that I see happening, and they don't seem fair. They don't seem right as I would deem them right. And so I think that is the interesting point, right? They don't seem to align. The things that God does, they don't seem to, not all the time, right? They don't seem to always align with what we would sort of project on God to do. And so the only reason I can draw is that objectively, God is sort of looking back at time and is saying like, these are the things, these are the people, these are the nations that I will establish, and from them there will be a good. And I think, how God establishes Tyre, you almost see the opposite of that in Job, right? Of how Job is someone who has done and committed his life to God, and yet bad things happen to him. And so again, you can kind of wonder at like, well, that doesn't seem right, right? You have Tyre over here, like in Babylon, not serving God and being established, being in Eden, and you have Job over here serving God, but then like suffering. And so these two things you see, like, and they appear in such contrast. And so I think, but that's not to say that there isn't a harmony between them. And I think like looking at both of them and seeing the middle, I think that is where I feel like we really start to meet God, right? Because he's, again, like there's a level of inscrutability, or there's a level of like we cannot search out and know the completeness of God at this moment. And I think that was sort of God's response to Job at the end of Job. But nonetheless, it is very interesting, I find. So I think also in these verses you kind of get hints of, you know, Satan being cast out of heaven in here. Like say in verse 14, you were the anointed cherub who covers and protects. I placed you there. You were in the holy mountain of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. And again, but I think this is also another interesting part, that like in the establishing of Tyre, it's not as though like and this almost is like a separate topic, right? It's not as though the evil came from outside of them and came in, kind of that as it appears with Cain, but it's more as if it's something that came from within them and then went out, right? So it says like from verse 15 to 16, you know, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness and evil were found in you. Through the abundance of your commerce, you were internally filled with lawlessness and violence, and you sinned. So it was as if these things that they were doing caused them to fall away, right, or to miss the mark, caused them to just change the direction that they were going in. And so, yeah, that's kind of a separate topic of like how does evil come from without, or does it come from within? So it seems then in the example of Tyre that it came from within. But interesting thing to sort of wonder about, like, you know, how does God act, and like why are people in the positions that they are in? And again, if you believe that God is omnipotent, then you have to say like, well, he's sort of like behind everything. He's like ordering everything. But then when you look at Tyre, you have to say that, well, like, or Babylon, right? For instance, there's these nations that are clearly not serving God, and yet God is like saying that I'm establishing them. You were in Eden, the garden of God, right? They were prepared. All these things were prepared on the day that Tyre was created. So you have this like interesting dichotomy between the things that, like, it's so tough to say. It's so tough to like put it into exacting words, because you have to balance like God's omnipotence and really his like complete goodness with things like him establishing the nation of Tyre, right? So it's how do you there has to be some objective good that is happening that is above, and I would say probably beyond, our subjective comprehension. So that's my take on that. I think that was kind of all I wanted to say about that. Something I've been thinking about, and again, I don't think this like points at God of like this points at God as being this like evil being, or this like being with you know, malintent. I think it really, what it points at is God is like much in ways I think more nuanced, and then even that doesn't quite feel right. But it seems as though God is like there's a level of like, just as I've been saying throughout this, a level of inscrutability where it seems as though these things that like we would say like this is right, this is wrong, this is how things should be, um, that's not really what we see. And so, but then I think again, like in Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, you see something like, well, why are the wicked prospering? Like why are these things the way they are? Um, and it's like God has some plan, and some ordering that is happening. I think, it's so tough. It's such a so to me it's such a deep question, such a deep thing to wonder about, because it brings up all these things of like, well, where does God's like ordering stop, and then where does say like Satan's free will and his choice and his really like desire to subvert God's goodness, where does that come in? And I don't really know. But like, you think of the you think of the like the Prince of Persia, right? Where like these clear like evil entities that are wrestling with the messengers of God, and so it's like you can't say that God is like behind all the evil things, as He's behind the good things, but because that would be incorrect conclusion. But there's like something in like God establishing these nations like Tyre, like Babylon, Babylon to judge the nations, right? Tyre, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know why, but that's what it says here. And so these are the things that I wonder about, you know. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. But I think like to wrap it up, I just wanted to say, in conclusion, that God is ultimately good, and everything He does for the good of humanity. I believe truly, and so you have to like look at these things and say like, well, why, and sort of look for the answer as to why does God establish these nations that seem to have no interest in serving Him. And if the conclusion I can draw, and perhaps I'm wrong, is that God's objective goodness is based on a set of principles that are higher and beyond our subjective comprehension. So that's what I thought about that. Thank you guys for watching, and yeah, I'm curious to know what you guys think. All right, thank you.